Hey, I'm Matt at Mr. Maple, and we're here with a special episode for you. I've got the original Mr. Maple.
Hey, I'm Norman.
And we're here in my dad's garden. Dad, how long have you been growing a food garden for?
Well, ever since I've had a small space in the backyard, I can get out here early in the mornings before it gets too hot and fill around a little bit, raise some squash, maybe some cucumbers, tomatoes, some sweet corn. And it's just a hobby that I do now since I don't have the maple.
Yeah, now you grew up growing a garden at home, right?
Oh yeah, we always had big garden, a lot of weeds when we were kids because we didn't always pull them out, but didn't have the equipment. I mean, if you got a little tiller and some good ground, you can grow a little garden.
Now, this area, when I started doing the nursery, was all greenhouses. It's changed quite a bit. How many greenhouses did we have in here in the back? Do you remember?
Originally, we had 5 greenhouses. We had 2 96-footers in the backyard here, 2 96-footers up here, and we had a 24-footer up here on next to the road.
It all started out with that one
48-foot.
Yeah, you had it right here about where this garden's at when Grandma talked you into it.
No, it's set up here where the big 96-footer is now.
Well, we've reclaimed a little bit of this space.
I used to originally, before I had a cold frame, had a bigger than 96-foot by 20-something shade house back here in this area here, and I had seedling Japanese maples growing in containers back there. Well, right here on this very spot.
So my girls love to get out here with Paw and play in the garden. So I wanted to get him on camera and talk to him a little bit about his garden today. You know, it's food gardening, so it's a little bit different than what you're used to at Mr. Maple. But Dad, what are the main things you're growing right now in your food garden?
Well, I like to grow some kind of sweet corn. This year I'm growing, I think it's peaches and cream. One of my favorites was candy corn, but the candy corn is a lot taller stalks, and last year they were up silking and the wind blew them all down. So I tried to use something a little shorter. I used ambrosia this year and it stood up a little better. And I learned that it's better to have a little bit of weeds down here and have good firm ground than to get in there and work it and let the wind blow your corn stalks down.
I know a few years early on when we had that greenhouse, somebody probably thought we were growing marijuana in the greenhouse because the helicopter came down over the corn and left a crop circle there in the corn in Dad's garden. So he wasn't too happy when the helicopter lowered down to look into the greenhouse and blew all of his corn over that year either. Now, what other kind of crops are you growing here this year, Dad?
Well, I'm growing potatoes. Here I had dug up potatoes from seeds from last year, and I went back and I just planted them and had quite a few volunteers, and I just messed the garden around them. And last year when my corn didn't mature out right for good sweet corn, I just tilled it all under, and I had quite a few volunteers in the garden this year come up, and that really surprised the birds because they didn't know what to pull. So I didn't have to replant this year because I had so many corn stalks that the birds didn't know what was what.
Now, you gave us a tip for keeping the weeds around the corn to keep the ground good and secure. Any tips for potatoes? Do you have any tips for growing potatoes?
Well, I just hill them up and I go through and I'll look for potato bugs. It's actually a Colorado bean beetle, but we know them as tater bugs because that's what they get on around here. And I just pick the mature beetles off before they get to lay any eggs. And my tomatoes, I just try to space them out and put them up on some kind of, I've tried different ways, but my old-fashioned way of doing this was some bean wire across the tops of stakes. I have went in and drove bamboo in the ground for stakes, but I decided that they were too hard to get up in the fall when you got through cropping, so I just went ahead and got me some metal stakes, and I can use them for several years.
Now, your main crops this year are corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and squash?
I've got some cucumbers, tomatoes, and squash. I like the straight neck squash, and you got to pick your squash every day when it's in season, because if you let a little one get by, the next day it's going to be too big and tough
I like the fried squash. If you notice,
I love it.
Dad's been growing them right around here. We've been doing this garden my whole life. I've spent endless hours in these gardens with my dad growing up. And yeah, we like to eat. So we get some fried squash out of there. Mom makes some really good fried squash. And the corn that Dad grows is legendary. His corn is the talk of the neighborhood because it's always that sweeter corn, and it's just better than what you get when you're out at a restaurant. It just is. I've never had corn at a restaurant that quite matched Dad's corn or the squash Mom makes, those fried squash. We had some yesterday, and it was awesome. Now, Dad, what kind of crops have you grown in the past that you might not be growing anymore? Like, what else were you growing before?
Well, I used to grow a lot of half runner beans, but they got to be so labor intensive on us. Hey, first
sitting on a porch breaking beans. I don't think you're from the South unless you sat on a porch and broke beans.
And then I always canned them. I used to can at least 100 canned quarts of beans every year, but nobody eats them but me as much. So
now, I was actually going to ask you a little bit about the canning process. I was going to ask a little bit about what you do with the access. I know a lot of it goes to neighbors, friends, and family. How big did you used to do your canning process? I know you had a whole room for that.
Well, we canned down in the basement on the stove down there, and that way the heat didn't get all through the house. But I got away from it because we weren't eating the beans fast enough. So. But we always share some of our bounty here. We give the neighbors cucumbers and squash. I might share a little bit of my sweet corn, and some tomatoes. But
now, there's nothing my girls like more than when Paw lets the squash get too big, because when the squash gets too big, those get to be made into monsters. And so Grandma gets out the art kit, they make toothpick monsters out of those. And so Carolina and Tinsley love when Paw misses the squash for a day, because that means they've got some creatures to create in the garden. So what are some of the main advices you would give people for growing squash, other than pulling it every day? Do you have any other tips for squash?
Main thing on squash is, now I like the straight neck versus the crook neck squash. The crook neck will bear a little more, heavier, but it tends to get the blight more, and I always want to water them in the mornings and instead of the evening. That's the big secret of having a garden. A good garden is have it close enough to a water hose where you can water your tomatoes and your cucumbers. And if you have any other things, we've ate cantaloupe this year, and I had my granddaughter down there. She put out 6 little seeds from the cantaloupes that we'd gotten earlier in the season, and they're already up and vining and putting on blooms. And she had some giant pumpkins, and she's planted 3 of those in a little corner there, and they're already up and starting to run into bloom as well.
Now, I know you get down here and maintain this garden meticulously, and Carolina loves to come and watch. What are some of the main things she likes to do with you in this garden?
She likes to go along and look at the things and ask, well, what's this, Pawpaw? Oh, that's a tomato vine.
Right.
Well, you like ketchup and all that, and sliced tomatoes, and that's how they grow. And she likes the squash, and she looks and sees, well, corn. Well, oh, I see where the corn's coming from. And it's very educational for the kids when you go out there and till the garden in, and let them come out there and plant some potatoes in the row with you, and take the hoe and show them how to cover them over. And they always want to come and look at the garden, and it's very educational. They don't look here and say, well, that's a watermelon plant. No, that's a corn plant. And you come over here, and here's the tomatoes. And the main thing is plant your potatoes so they get early enough that they got time to harvest. You can grab on them all summer long once they start bearing. And your tomatoes, plant them far enough apart and heap them up where you can water them, make your little bowl around them and keep them watered that way. And the cucumbers, water them, but water them in the mornings so they won't get the blight. And I try to get 2 or 3 different varieties of cucumbers and start them early. There's some good tips about gardening. Get out in the spring, you get your ground all tilled up, get the garden in early enough. After frost chance is gone for your tomatoes and cucumbers and squash. But you can always plant your potatoes earlier. Just wait till your ground warms up for your corn. and have a good length of garden hose to get to it to water it when it gets to a little dry spell. Always get it going good. And best thing about having a little garden in the backyard is having a good wife that'll cook the vegetables up for you to eat when you get them in the harvest, and have you a good shady spot to take a rest. But the main thing is get out there early in the mornings and work in the garden before it gets too hot.
Hey, Pawpaw, who do you have with you today?
I've got two of my granddaughters with me. I've got Carolina and Tinsley.
Do you love teaching them about gardening? What do you do with gardening with them?
Well, at young kids, it's really hard to get them really interested in gardens, but they understand the planting seeds in the garden and watching them come up. Carolina likes to get the overgrown squash and likes to make what we call squash monsters with toothpicks and stuff with them.
Carolina, do you like to make the squash people with Grandma?
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite thing about Pawpaw's garden?
Ice cream.